So we are pretty familiar with the trials and tribulations of the work of the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts. At least I hope we are, because we preached all the way through the book of Acts in the last couple of years. So I thought I'd begin our message this morning out of 1 Corinthians by talking about one of the missionaries from a few centuries ago that has had a pretty significant impact on world missions. And his name is Adoniram Judson. That first name is a bear, but Judson lived from 1788 to 1850. And this is really not just the story of Adoniram, but also his wife Ann, because they're inextricably linked in this. They were married in 1812 and had their first child, she was pregnant while they were on the boat going from India to Burma to be missionaries in Burma. Unfortunately, she miscarried that first child. When they arrived in Burma, Adoniram studied 12 hours a day to try to learn Burmese for 3 years. He was working from scratch. There wasn't a Burmese to English dictionary. It didn't exist. He actually created one that is still basically in use to this day. During those 3 years, they had virtually no contact with any other Americans or with any Europeans. They were isolated. 4 years after they arrived, Adoniram felt that he was ready to hold his first public church service. 4 years before they were ready for that. 15 men came, mostly they think out of curiosity, just to see what these guys were up to. 2 months later, they had their first baptism, their first conversion. One man, just one, after 4 years. They had very little success in those early years because the gulf between Buddhism and the gospel is a very difficult one to overcome. Very hard to explain what needed to be done there. Well, while they were there and while this continued, they had a second child. They named him Roger, but he died at 8 months old. In 1817, after they'd been there for 5 years, Adoniram finished that Burmese grammar, and he had translated the Gospel of Matthew into Burmese. He had a printing press brought over, and they printed 800 copies of the Gospel of Matthew, the first thing that had ever been printed in the Burmese language. By 1822, there were 18 believers. So 10 years in, they had 18 believers. At that point, Ann was more fluent in Burmese than he was. She was a big part of his ministry. Adoniram's attitude was, and this is a quote, "Preach the gospel, not anti-Buddhism." So he was trying to thread that needle between the gospel's message and not just being anti-Buddhism, because that would have been very difficult in that culture. In 1823, he finished the New Testament in the translation work. Unfortunately, in 1824, the Anglo-Burmese War broke out. Not one you learned about in your history books, but this is a war between Burma and England, more almost actually between the East India Company and Burma. Unfortunately for any Europeans or Americans in Burma at the time, they were held suspect. And Judson was put in prison for 17 months. They claimed he was a spy. He lived there in brutal conditions. Many of his fellow prisoners and some prisoners of war that were kept with him died from the tough conditions. During this point, Ann was tirelessly working for his release, going to different officials and trying to get him released, all while having an infant in tow. Her third pregnancy, this time the child had lived. Finally, after 17 months, he was released. But that same year, in 1826, Ann died from a disease. And 6 months later, her third child died as well. So after all of this, he's got a handful of converts. He's had 3 children, 1 miscarriage, 2 died in infancy, and his wife gone. After the war, however, Christianity began to spread rapidly, not amongst the Buddhists that he had been working with, but amongst the animist tribes in the north, in the jungle. So after the death of Ann, while Adoniram himself was fighting depression, as you can imagine, while he was struggling with whether or not this was worth it and he was getting anything done, he began taking solo trips by canoe upriver into the jungle to the villages. In 1834, after 24 years, his translation of the Bible was finished. In 1835, he married a woman named Sarah Boardman. Sarah Boardman was the widow of a fellow Burmese missionary. Her husband died, his wife died, and they married a second marriage for both of them. They had 8 children, 5 of whom lived. Then she died in 1845. 37 years, Adoniram Judson and his wife and his second wife were working in Burma. 37 years of effort. But in the end, they founded 100 churches and had about 8,000 converts. It was certainly worth it in the end, but not always easy to see that in the middle. So let's think of that as we ponder the words of the Apostle Paul in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 9. This is picking up where we left off last time we were in 1 Corinthians. I'll give you a reminder. Previously, Paul was writing about sexual immorality, then he was writing about marriage, and then he just got done writing about that culturally difficult question of meat offered to idols. The Christians in Corinth, should they eat meat that had come from the pagan temples? It was a very weird, very interesting issue. He in the end told them, if it causes your fellow Christians to sin, don't eat it, but if it doesn't bother them, then it's fine. So it was kind of an interesting thing. He just finished talking about that, and here's the new text. Paul says, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not the result of my work in the Lord? Even though I may not be an apostle to others, surely I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. So Paul just wrote about putting limitations on our freedom as Christians. He told us, don't hurt your brother, don't hurt your sister in Christ by your freedom. Now Paul will show how he has limited his own freedom, his rights as an apostle for the sake of the gospel. He mentions the fact that he is an apostle. Paul has more of a claim to have rights and privileges as a minister of the gospel than some other church leaders. Not only that, he was personally chosen by Jesus. Jesus appeared to Paul and said, I am choosing you. If anybody has a call, a cause, a case for privileges, for rights and obligations to be given to him, it would be the Apostle Paul. Not only that, he says, you are my seal. You, amongst the other churches I have founded, are the proof that what I am doing is effective, that my ministry works, that it's important, that the God is working through me because you exist. They exist because of God's work through Paul. So why is Paul talking about this? This is a big prologue about his rights, about his authority. Where's he going with this? Paul says, this is my defense to those who sit in judgment on me. Don't we have the right to food and drink? Don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas? Or is it only I and Barnabas who lack the right not to work for a living? Paul says, this is my defense, this is my judgment, because apparently he was being criticized in Corinth as somehow a lesser apostle, as someone with less authority because he didn't demand his rights. This is an interesting irony. Paul is being humble, Paul is being self-sacrificial for the sake of the gospel, and his critics are looking at that as a sign of weakness. Because Paul doesn't demand what is due him, he must not be that important. Second, point there, he says, do we not have the right to food and drink? Paul's missionary work and that of his team, Barnabas and the rest of his team, was a path of hardship. We've seen that in the book of Acts. He should have been supported by the church he founded, the churches he founded, the church that he ministered, the churches that he ministered to as he continued to sow the gospel seed. He should have had the quote-unquote luxury of bringing his family along, as apparently Peter and some others did. But he didn't do any of that, and he didn't have any of that. Paul talks about not working for a living. In contrast to his rights, Paul continued to support himself, and Barnabas continued to support himself. But why? This print's a little small there, I had to fit it all. Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and doesn't eat its grapes? Who tends a flock and doesn't drink the milk? Do I say this merely on human authority? Doesn't the law of Moses say the same thing? For it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain. Is it about oxen that God is concerned? Surely he says this for us, doesn't he? Yes, this was written for us because whoever plows and threshes should be able to do so in the hope of sharing in the harvest. Before he gets to his conclusion, Paul gives some practical examples. He says soldiers and farmers and shepherds, they all need to eat. They do a task and they reap something from it. They benefit from it. Not only that, but so does the ox on the farm. So do the draft animals. You don't make them work without letting them eat. This analogy here about the ox treading out the grain. They used to put the oxen in a press in a circular motion and they'd walk around. But if you put a muzzle on the ox, he couldn't eat the grain while he walked around. He might work a little harder that way and not be distracted, but it's kind of rude, isn't it? Let the man have something to eat while he's working. Paul says if God cares this much about the oxen, surely he cares about us too. So let's step back from this for a minute. We're not in the first century. We're not in the same situation that Paul and these churches were. There were a few churches. They weren't very well connected or organized yet. They didn't have a lot of resources. Maybe they were doing the best they can. It's hard to say. Paul is dealing with them, but let's step back from that and look at ourselves. How are Baptists in general, American Baptists in our case, how are Baptists at supporting missionaries and ministers? An interesting question. Paul's telling them about it. How are we doing? Well, let me start close to home and then work out. I think that this church has been generous to me in that respect. I consider myself to be properly compensated. I'm happy we have the resources to be able to do that. Not every church does. However, our missionary support is haphazard, to say the least. It's not standardized in any way. We help this one and this one and this one, a little bit here and a little bit there. It's difficult. For example, Brian and Lynette Smith. You guys have met them. Brian and Lynette will be leaving for Haiti soon to begin their missionary work there. But you might notice that we first heard from Brian and Lynette several years ago. Not only did they need to learn the language, did they need to learn about what it was like to minister in Haiti, they also had to spend about 2 years, and that's the typical amount. They had to spend 2 years driving all over the country, and they've been from the East Coast to the West and the South. They've been everywhere. Tens of thousands of miles of driving church after church after church on a Sunday morning to share with the people, just to get enough funds to be supported. That's not good. It's not useful. It's not proper that our missionaries should spend a year, 2 years, 3 years of time they could be on the field sharing the gospel, trying to drum up support. It's not good. It's not easy to fix. It's not easy for us to change because our structure as Baptists is loose. We don't get a directive from the regional leadership that says, this is the new missionary, this is the amount that you owe for their support. Your church has this many people as a percentage, $212 a month. That's your support for this missionary. We've commissioned them, now they can go. We don't do that. Other denominations do something very much like that, but we don't. This is difficult, and this is something that in the long run, if we could improve, it would be better, because that's time wasted. They could have been in Haiti last year. And that experience is common amongst Baptist and independent church missionaries, Bible church missionaries. This is what we do for our missionaries, and it's not very good. So what about the next generation? What are we doing to raise up missionaries and ministers and help them get from wanting to go into the ministry to being in the ministry? The answer, of course, is not much. Let me back up and look at my own life and contemplate how I got from where I started to where I am here. You guys know I grew up in Galilee Baptist Church in Saranac, Michigan. Went to that church my whole life. My parents and my brother and sister are still at that church. When I first had the notion that the ministry was something that I wanted to do, I called my pastor, and he came over and he prayed with me, and we talked about that. But there really wasn't much else. It was up to me to decide what school to go to. It was up to me to decide how to pay for that. It was up to me to decide what to study and how to go from there. There wasn't any oversight. There wasn't any mentoring. We just didn't do that. That was an independent Baptist church, not an American Baptist church, but it's really not any different. And once you graduate, or once you finish your training, whatever that is, undergrad, MDiv, whatever degree you get, whatever process you do, you're completely on your own. Some of you know that about my story. I started out of college as a youth pastor at a United Methodist church and a Reformed church. I had 2 part-time youth pastor jobs while I had another job during the middle of the week. That's not a career, that's surviving. And it wasn't surviving very well. You also know I ended up being a teacher for 10 years because I couldn't get into this field properly. I couldn't make this a job, a career. It was just something on the side. And believe you me, being a bivocational pastor where you work one job Monday to Friday or whatever your schedule is and then try to be a pastor on Sunday is not easy. It's not efficient, it's not useful, it makes everything a series of compromises. I really need to go visit someone at the hospital, but I got to be at work. Am I going to have to go do that after work? It's exhausting, it's difficult, it's distracting, it's not useful. And we know some churches are forced into it because they're small, usually because they're rural. It's difficult. Our United Methodist brothers and sisters across the street and across the block and over that way, because they're everywhere around here, they do that differently. When they're too small to pay for a pastor all by themselves, they give you 2 or 3 or 4 churches. That's not ideal either, by the way. You imagine that Sunday morning, church, drive, church, drive, church. You're not at any of them. You're fighting to get through the morning all together. That's not good either. So we struggle with these things. I was at First Baptist of Powell in Michigan for 5 years as a part-time pastor while I was teaching days, nights, and summers in order to try to get by. Finally, when we arrived here, I talked about this at our pastor's retreat I had last week. For me, coming here felt like a relief. And that's not just you guys, all right? You guys are great, but that's not just you. It's because I wasn't teaching anymore, because I wasn't distracted anymore, because I could actually get up in the morning and go do my job and not worry about all those other things. And for the first time in 2 years, we had health insurance. And for the first time in a while, I had retirement stuff that I was working towards. It was a relief. But we struggle with this as Baptists. And one of the things that I have sort of made a personal vow is that if we have a young person or a young adult in our congregation that says, I want to be a missionary, I want to be a minister, I'm not going to let them flounder. It will be my responsibility to make sure that person has some guidance and some mentoring, and you along with me. We will not be on the sidelines saying, good luck, little dove, fly. Hope you don't crash and burn. That was a really weird mixed metaphor. Sorry about that. That's what we're going to do. And because of our structure as Baptists, that's probably the best we can do. But we need to work on that. And then there's one other aspect of this. What about at the end of it? What about when you retire? If you live long enough to actually retire, what about that? We have two primary things as American Baptists that we're doing. One is called MMBB. It's all acronyms. MMBB is the retirement plan that this church participates in. They put a portion of my salary toward it, and that will ensure that it's also disability, that if I were to die or be disabled, that Nicole and Clara wouldn't be left in the cold, and also that we will have a retirement. And then we also have our once a year RMMO offering, right? You know that one, the Retired Minister and Missionaries offering that supports the ones that didn't have a chance to plan ahead, the ones that aren't able to pay their bills. So we're doing okay there, and we've got some structure there. It's kind of a mixed bag. We're doing decently locally, but we struggle with missionaries. We have these structural things on our denomination that make this harder than it has to be. This is a fascinating topic to me. I talk about this in particular with people like Pastor Jeff. Pastor Jeff didn't get to decide when it was time to leave here and go to Sagertown. That was higher up. Maybe it was a good time, maybe it wasn't. But that's hard to deal with, right? Not being in control of your destiny. But on the flip side, when Pastor Jeff graduated, they said, "You're going here, here's a job." So we both have that perspective, the good and the bad, and how we do it. Paul struggled with those things. Paul dealt with those things. Let's finish up the text this morning. We got a little bit more to go. He says, "If we've sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you? If others have this right of support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more? But we do not use this right. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ." And here we finally find the motivation for why Paul doesn't demand his rights. You see, this is something that we know that maybe you're not thinking about. The church is not a business, by the way. I know some churches sell a lot of stuff on their website, but we are not a business. We don't sell my sermons and my books, by the way. It wouldn't bring in much money anyway, so we're not worried about that. But we don't have any income. We don't generate revenue by what we do, right? We don't get a check in the mail from someone every time we have a baptism or a convert or something like that, right? That doesn't make money. Our product, the thing that we are creating, is spiritually mature Christians. But somebody's got to pay for that process, right? It doesn't just happen magically. It has to be supported by those, and I love these terms, those with quote-unquote real jobs. So those of you with a real job support those of us working in this industry where we don't have real jobs. Those of you who work for a living. I love that. That's so much fun. I appreciate that. And yes, I have heard that. Wouldn't it be nice to only work one day a week? I have heard that before, and that's an old joke, and it's still just as funny as it ever was. But it's necessary, is it not? Because the work that I do here does not generate money. Cheryl's work doesn't generate money. Dennis's work doesn't generate money. Dick and Gary and Carrie and Tunda, none of us generate money by the work that we do. So it's got to come from somewhere else. That's the only way that this is going to work. Unless, of course, we decide to go down a different road. And we decide that, you know what, those who work for God would be better off if they were paupers. If the people working for God, doing the ministry for God, if they were dirt poor, that would be ideal. That would make it easier. And I have actually seen this argument made. And it was made in the direction of a minister, that if we keep him poor, we'll keep him humble. And if we keep him humble, he'll be a better minister. All right, I'm not going with that, because that means simply you're keeping him distracted. You're keeping him worried about clothing his children and putting food on their table and perhaps having to take a job on the side so that he can do the spiritual work that he's been called for or she's been called for. That's ridiculous. You see, what a church, what a ministry, what a missions agency can afford is what they should do. It's not always what they're willing to do, but it's something we definitely need to worry about, and something that Paul takes the time to talk about. It's an important topic, but guess what? That's not what Paul's really worried about here. Paul's not actually talking about that. He's reminding them of that, but for a different reason, and that is at the end of this section. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ. Paul chose to ignore his rights for the sake of the gospel. Paul chose not to exercise the obligation that they had to him for the sake of the gospel. Paul chose to work without compensation for the sake of the gospel. Because in his mind, if he demanded his rights, it might put the gospel work at risk. It might hinder his ability to go where he needed to go and do what he needed to do for the sake of the gospel. How many of us can say that we would do the same for the gospel? Certainly seems like Adoniram and Judson did exactly that, and others in history have. It's pretty amazing. Paul says, don't you know that those who serve in the temple get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in what is offered on the altar. In the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. Before he finishes, Paul says, this is a command of God. This is not just a luxury. This is the way it ought to be. Paul didn't exercise his right, but the last thing that Paul wanted was that for 500 or 1,000 or 1,500 years later, for a church to read this and say, see, our missionary doesn't deserve support. They don't need it because Paul didn't need it. And we want our missionary to be just like Paul. Paul says, don't do that. Don't use my forbearance and my hardship as an excuse to put somebody else through the same thing. The church needs to give to the work of God generously. The church's workers need to focus on the will of God, not on their own survival. That's something quite clear in Paul's words. And then lastly, we end with this. But I have not used any of these rights. I'm not writing this in hope that you'll do such things for me. For I would rather die than allow anyone to deprive me of this boast. For when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast, since I'm being compelled to preach. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. If I preach voluntarily, I have a reward. If not voluntarily, I'm simply discharging the trust committed to me. What then is my reward? Just this, that in preaching the gospel I may offer it free of charge, and so not make full use of my rights as a preacher of the gospel. That first part is Paul saying, this letter is not a guilt trip. Don't send me money. He's not trying to get them to change their mind about his personal support. He's talking for the future, not for himself. And then he says something profound. I am compelled to preach. That is an important thing to consider. When we talk to someone, do you think you are called to be a missionary, called to be a minister? Are you compelled to preach? Because if you are not compelled to this, if you do not feel like this is what you must do, then do something else. Because you'll get into it, and you'll realize it's hard, and you'll have a discouraging moment, and then you'll quit. Because you're not compelled to do it. Paul says, this is not optional for me. I'm going to preach, whether you support me or not, whether my health is good or not, whether I'm in prison or not. Paul said it matters not to him. This is what he is called to do. It's what he's going to do. So let us end with this thought. We've talked about the church. We've talked about us locally. We've talked about the denomination. we're going to narrow it all the way to you. What about you? What about me? What about each of us individually? How much do we care about the gospel? Now, I put that as a how much, not as a do we care about the gospel, because I absolutely do believe that we care about the gospel. I think every one of you cares about the gospel. The question is how much, and in what way, and how do you show it? Do we care about protecting the message of the gospel from heresy and from error? Do we care about proclaiming the gospel to those who need to hear it? Do we care about those who need to accept the gospel and be saved? How much do we care? And let me tell you something that I think you already know. Putting money in the offering plate is not the end of your obligation to the proclamation of the gospel. That's not where it ends. Your obligation to the gospel does not end when you put in the money that allows me to do this. That's the beginning of your obligation, not the end. It's important, it's necessary, it's helpful, and this church depends upon it, but that is not where it ends. And there's a second thing. Praying for me and the ministries of this church is not enough. It's essential, it's necessary, and we depend upon it. But that is not where it ends. It ends somewhere beyond that, right? When you speak and say and do on behalf of the gospel. Because let me let you in on a little secret. This church will not grow. This ministry will not explode and expand and be all that it can be based on the interactions that just I have with people. You know why? Because there's only one of me. And I only know so many people. And I can only talk to so many people. Each of you know people that I will never really know. Each of you interacts with people on a regular, weekly, even daily basis that I will not. And let me tell you something even more important. And hear this if you hear nothing else. There are people in your lives that might accept the gospel from you that would not accept it from me. Has that sunk in? That relative of yours, that friend of yours, that coworker of yours, that you care about them being saved. It may not be enough to get them to come to church and hear me preach. Because I've heard this before. Of course he cares about the gospel, it's his job. Of course he wants to tell me about Jesus, it's his job. It's not your job in their mind. It is your job. Christ gave it to you, but they don't think that way. So that when you share the gospel, when you show that you care that someone accepts Jesus Christ, it means more than when I do it. Even if we both care just as much, because that's their perception, that this is my job. And so of course I care, right? Just like if I was a salesman for a company, of course I would care if you used that product and bought that product. But when you, who don't work for the company, when you talk about the product, they say, oh, it's customer feedback. Don't you look at the customer feedback on Amazon? You don't look at what the company says about the product. You look at what the customers say about the product. And that's you guys. So what sacrifices, what risks are each of us willing to make for the sake of the gospel? What are we willing to do to show that we care about the gospel and that we care a great deal? Let's sum that up as we finish. Number one, your rights and privileges are not more important than the gospel. They're not. Mine aren't, yours aren't. None of our rights are more important than the gospel. Secondly, supporting your church is part of your obligation to the gospel. Whether that's the offering plate or volunteering or being on the board, that is part, but that is not your only obligation, and it can never be your only obligation. Please don't let it be. And thirdly, simple question to end with, what are you willing to risk on behalf of sharing the gospel with others? What are you willing to risk? What are you willing to put into play? Your reputation, embarrassment, being rejected, being laughed at? What are you willing to put to risk for the gospel?